Okay, this video is going to be on Section 1 of Chapter 19, and I will tell you that straight up that we're not going to be paying too much attention to this section in terms of overall knowledge, but one of the things you do have to know about this is because that leads to the next section, which is on conformity. And there is some fascinating stuff in there. But if we're going to talk about conformity, we first have to talk about groups. So, in looking first at the concept of a group, I want you to harken back to the idea of a clique. Clique is a classic example of a group. And if you look at the definition on page 545, a collection of people have shared goals, a degree of interdependence, and some amount of communication. Although it literally can be anything. I mean, we don't have to talk about a social clique that you might find, for instance, in high school. I used to bowl. I'd be on a bowling team. And you would find we have shared goals. We want to succeed at the task, which was to knock down as many pins as possible, more or less. There'd be an element of interdependence in the fact that we would root one another on, and one person's success contributed to everyone's success. And obviously, there has to be a certain amount of communication. When are we going to meet? When is the league? We got to make sure we're there. Okay, there's a tournament. Schedule, time, and place. There's a certain amount of communication going on, and this is true literally of any group. Now, we mentioned these concepts of interdependence and communication. Very briefly, interdependence is not necessarily when you have group projects in high school, because sometimes there may not be some interdependence there. When we're talking about interdependence within a group, the collection of people develops interdependence when any action by one member affects or influences those of the other members. Now, technically, that also happens with a group project, even in high school, because if everyone else is not doing the work, someone may end up picking up the slack. There's an element of interdependence there, but it is unequal. Ideally, in group situations, you do have shared responsibilities, leading to a more equal interdependence. And communication. Obviously, critically, you're doing a group project in high school, you got to communicate. What is it that we're trying to do with this group project? Who's going to be responsible for what? When are they going to do it? Even you guys had to do that with your commercials that you did for me earlier this year. Then there's this concept of shared goals, and this ties into a broader idea in social psychology of task orientation versus social orientation. Task functions are pretty straightforward. If you look at, again, the class project, you've got this thing the teacher gave to you, and that has to be done. That's the task. Okay. Functions of the group are going to be oriented toward accomplishing the task, but there are also often coincident social concerns. Okay. For instance, if you had to go back and do that commercial with me, one of the things you keep in mind is, well, who has the best video recording equipment? Or who tends to enjoy video taping the most? You might take this into consideration, not just for the task concern, but also for the social concern of giving that person something to do in which they are good at, or considering the feelings of the person involved. These are elements that are inextricably entwined, at least in most cases, in group function. And this broader idea of a person being task-oriented or socially oriented comes into play. When you have people that are excessively socially oriented, sometimes the task can suffer. On the other hand, if you have people who are excessively task-oriented, we have to get this thing done, well, they might be great at getting the job done, but they might trample on other people's feelings in the process of doing so. So a balance needs to be maintained. Pardon me. Balance needs to be made. Now it sounds even worse. There we go. Balance needs to be maintained between getting the job done, but also meeting people's social needs within the group as you're achieving that task. Now, how groups are held together. This component here is critically important. When you look at norms, these are unspoken rules that groups follow to interact on a regular basis. Now, there's all sorts of norms. When we talk about cliques in the past, I talked to you about some of the norms that were in place for the various groups when I was in high school. Okay, the stoners, well, they were supposed to indulge in marijuana at least once a week. Their clothing was very much not of the lines of polo shirts and penny loafers. They tended to wear blue jeans, for instance. The athlete group, the preppy group, they, on the other hand, did have this uniform where they were penny loafers, they were straight leg Levi's, that were the polo shirts. And for the most part, the social norm was they had to go out and get drunk on weekends. The nerds, they were focused on their studies. And it's interesting, their group was much less cohesive. They tended to work somewhat more independently. On the other hand, if you're talking about the gamer group, they tended to be teetotalers. They tended to wear wide-leg jeans. That was the norm at the time. And the idea was they'd get together at least once a week and play some sort of game. Oh, and yeah, I mentioned again, no drug use. Okay. Now, these are the norms. These are the norms when I was growing up, and they're going to vary from group to group. There's an interesting component with regards to social norms on page 549. I would urge you to read that. But these are norms that are associated with our culture, and they vary from culture to culture. Like, how far away do you stand from someone when you're talking to them? Where is eye contact when you're talking with them? And even head position when you're engaged in eye contact. If you're walking down a street and you're in a sense making eye contact with people just to make sure you don't run into them, okay, the eye contact is kind of like this, okay, and then you look and you just make sure, okay, and you might go a little bit sidelong, but it won't be anything like that. Notice the head position. The social norm for head position when it comes to strangers, pretty much straight on, okay, and the eyes might go a little bit like this. But what happens if you're dealing with someone who, walking down the street, and you happen to look out of the corner of your eye and you see their head going like this? Okay, if the head angle changes too much, now a norm has been violated. Okay, now it's no longer, we're checking to navigate to make sure we don't run into someone. When someone starts going like this, it's like, okay, is there a problem? Is there something wrong with me? Is this person harassing me? Are they being a creeper? Whatever it is. The point is, it's a norm violation, which can cause a little increase in stress. I'd urge you to read that section. It's really quite fascinating. So groups are held together by norms. Sometimes groups are held together by ideology. Most commonly, religion, politics, and nowadays, it's somewhat tied into politics, but it could be a little bit different. With this lockdown we're suffering, you're starting to see two different camps develop. You're seeing one camp that says, okay, everyone has to stay at home. For the safety of everyone, everyone's got to stay home. And you have people who are absolutely committed to that. They don't want to see people going out at all. Okay? And if they see people going out for a walk, they're actually going to call the snitch line and say, hey, so-and-so's out for a walk. They shouldn't be. They're violating the stay-at-home order. Then you have others who are saying, this is much ado about nothing. We got to get the economy rolling again because a lot of people aren't working, and if you don't work, you don't earn money. You don't earn money, you can't pay rent. You also, if you can't earn money, you're not making money for food, and so on. And you've got these two competing ideologies that are really starting to manifest. Some of it's tied into politics, but it's more along the lines of where are you falling in relation to this lockdown. And I am trying to emphasize I am not, my foot is in neither camp. Finally, there's this element of commitment. How committed are you to the group? One of the problems with high school project groups is there isn't real strong commitment there. It's like the teacher gave an assignment, just trying to get it done. You tend to be more committed to those of your clique or your posse or your crew or your squad, whatever your noun is, than you are to any one group that you would be doing a project with. I was fairly committed to my bowling group, but I mean, it wasn't, it's like, well, if we don't end up playing for a weekend, that's okay. It's not like they were super close friends. Certainly not as committed as I would be, for instance, to family, or potentially even, depending upon the circumstance, a church group. My father-in-law was very identified via political ideology, so he was great friends with the particular stripe of politics that he was associated with, and no, I'm not going to share that. Now, I want to take a look briefly at types of groups. Let's see, I still have some time. Page 549. taking a look at those italicized groups. When a group's member identify with their group, they're considered to be part of the in-group. And if you are not identified with that, then you are thought to be the out-group. In my high school clique situation, they were very much in-groups. You know, those who were in the in-group, they were the members of your clique, and those who were outside of that, they were part of the out-group. Okay? If you were a preppy, then the stoners and the nerds and the gamer geeks, they were all part of the out-group. Okay? But you can also note that second paragraph. A primary group is a group of people who interact daily face-to-face. Because of the frequencies of these interactions, some situations may become emotionally charged. For instance, you see your family members every day. You eat, sleep, have fun with them. You also fight with them. Whereas a secondary group is a larger group of people with whom you might have more impersonal relationships. For instance, your psychology class could be a secondary group. The church you belong to could perhaps be a larger secondary group rather than a primary group. Okay. With social facilitation and social inhibition, I am going to let you look at that for yourselves. Also, with regards to group polarization and decision making, I'm simply going to have you look at that for yourself. I do want you to look at this element of groupthink. That is a valuable term that you've got to be on the lookout for. Note the definition, page 551. Poor group decision making that occurs as a result of a group emphasizing unity over critical thinking. A classic example of this sort of thing, if you take a look at page 552, figure 19.6, you're going to see a picture of the Challenger explosion. Now here's what happened there. That particular launch took place in freezing temperatures. And that launch had already been delayed, I believe, once, maybe even twice, because of varying weather conditions and issues. So, and the problem with the shuttle launch back in the day is you had like this window of opportunity. You had like a 3-week window to get the thing off. If you didn't, then problems were going to come about. So anyway, they were getting to the end of their launch window. They had to get this thing off the ground. And as I mentioned, it was launched in freezing temperatures. Not to bore you with the details, but freezing temperatures rendered portions of the launch engines vulnerable to failure. Now, everyone within NASA, for the most part, had what was called go fever. It's like, we've got this launch window, we got to get this thing off the ground. There was a small group of engineers who said, now, wait a minute. We've got these freezing temperatures. It can be bad on the O-rings. We need to delay the launch. But the problem is the bulk of NASA caught with go fever. They were totally engaged with groupthink, and they said, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. Well, if you've seen any video of that particular launch, things clearly were not okay. And that small group of engineers who said, don't launch, that's a bad idea, ended up being right. But because of groupthink, they ended up doing the launch. And it took the lives of the 7 astronauts and ended up suspending shuttle launches, I think, for the next 2 years. Not to mention the fact that, whatever payload it was they were getting up in orbit, well, it never got there. Not to mention the fact they killed 7 astronauts in the process. All right, the section on leadership, I'm going to have you read that on your own and then tell you as a skeptical psych teacher that the research on leadership is not good. Okay? They have their theories there. I'll tell you straight up, I'm not going to test you on them because these particular theories, they're unable to replicate them. It's not really backed by research. They're just putting up some theory ideas to sound really cynical, to fill up space in the textbook. That's it for this particular section. I would urge you to read ahead. I'm not going to assign it till Monday, but I would urge you to read ahead to section 2. Conformity and obedience, there's some fascinating stuff in there. But we will be talking about Chapter 18, Section 3, and Chapter 19, Section 1 on Monday. Have a good weekend.